My name's Hank. Just Hank. Nothing flashy or dramatic about it. I'm a simple guy, a journeyman carpenter by trade, married to Marlene for 8 years. We've built a modest life together in a quiet part of Nebraska. Our days were as predictable as the sunrise, breakfast at the crack of dawn, me heading out to build someone's dream porch or kitchen, and Marlene managing the house and part-time shifts at the local diner. We didn't have kids, but we had our own little routines that felt like traditions. Every Friday, Marlene baked apple turnovers, and we'd sit on the porch, sipping coffee and watching the sky change colors. Our home wasn't much. A small ranch-style house with peeling paint and a stubborn door hinge that always creaked. But it was ours, and it was enough. Or so I thought. This story begins like any other ordinary Tuesday. The plumber was coming over to fix a leak under the kitchen sink. I'd noticed it dripping over the weekend and made the call Monday morning. Marlene, ever the practical one, said she'd handle it while I was at work. I didn't think much of it. She was good at keeping the house running while I focused on paying the bills. The plumber arrived just as I was lacing up my boots. A wiry guy in his late 30s, maybe early 40s, named Dave. Friendly enough, with a quick smile and a toolbox that had seen better days. He chatted about the weather while Marlene made coffee for him. I left them to it, gave Marlene a quick kiss on the cheek, and headed to the truck. As I drove to the job site, I thought about how lucky I was. Life wasn't glamorous, but it was steady, reliable, and I loved that about it. If only I'd known then how quickly that steadiness could crumble. I was out at a site helping frame up a barn for the Watsons, one of the local families with a sprawling property just outside of town. The work was straightforward, the kind I liked best. Precise cuts, strong joints, a clean structure rising from the ground like a testament to honest labor. My mind wandered as I worked, mostly to trivial things. The fishing trip I'd been meaning to plan, whether the truck needed a new set of tires, if Marlene had remembered to pick up eggs. Somewhere around mid-morning, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I wiped sawdust from my hands and pulled it out, expecting one of the guys on the crew, or maybe a reminder from Marlene. Instead, it was a text from her that read, "Everything's fine. Dave is taking longer than expected, but I've got it handled." I stared at the screen for a second. The message was innocuous enough, but something about it felt off. Marlene rarely texted me during the day unless it was urgent, or she needed me to grab something on my way home. And why emphasize that everything was fine? It wasn't like I'd asked. I shook off the odd feeling and got back to work. When quitting time rolled around, I was beat. My arms ached, and my back reminded me I wasn't as young as I used to be. I climbed into the truck, eager to head home, shower, and sink into my recliner with one of Marlene's turnovers. As I turned onto our street, I noticed Dave's van still parked in the driveway. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the lawn, but his van was unmistakable. A beat-up white thing with Smith Plumbing and Repairs stenciled on the side. Still here? I muttered to myself. The job couldn't have been that complicated. I pulled into the gravel drive, dust swirling around the truck as I parked. The house was quiet as I stepped inside, save for the faint murmur of voices coming from the kitchen. The sound stopped me in my tracks. Marlene's laugh, light and easy, followed by a man's voice that wasn't immediately familiar. I stood there for a moment, my boots still on, letting the sound sink in. There was nothing inherently suspicious about laughter or conversation, but something about the tone made my skin prickle. I set my tool belt on the hall bench and walked toward the kitchen, my steps deliberate but slow. The door was partially open, and I paused just outside, my breath catching when I heard Marlene speak. "You're terrible, Dave," she said, her voice playful, teasing. "I'm terrible? You're the one tempting me," he shot back, his tone dripping with that same playful edge. Tempting? I pushed the door open, my boots scraping against the worn linoleum floor. Marlene and Dave were standing by the sink. Close, too close. She was holding a glass of water, her hair slightly disheveled, while Dave leaned casually against the counter. His smile faded the moment he saw me. "Hey," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. Marlene jumped back slightly, her cheeks flushing as she quickly stepped away from Dave. She stammered something about me being home early, her tone more nervous than surprised. I corrected her, reminding her it was 6 o'clock, The same time I came home every day. My eyes flicked between them, catching the tension that filled the room. Dave, clearly uncomfortable, cleared his throat and grabbed a wrench from the counter, muttering about a snag under the sink and how one of the pipes needed replacing. He added that he was just finishing up. I cut him off curtly, arms crossed, and told him it was late and not to let me keep him. The tension in the room was palpable as Dave mumbled something about packing up his tools. He ducked under the sink, his movements rushed and clumsy, while Marlene busied herself wiping down the already clean countertop. I leaned against the doorway, watching them both. My gut told me something wasn't right, but I couldn't put my finger on it. I'd always trusted Marlene. Why wouldn't I? But now, as I stood there, the way her hands trembled slightly and the way Dave avoided my gaze fed the uneasy feeling growing in my chest. Dave finished quickly, shoving his tools back into his bag and muttering a quick goodbye. He avoided my eyes as he passed, practically sprinting to the front door. The van roared to life moments later, its taillights disappearing down the street. Once the sound of the engine faded, silence settled over the house. Marlene kept her back to me, scrubbing a spot on the counter that didn't need scrubbing. I broke the quiet, my voice cutting through the tense air as I asked what that had been about. She froze for a split second before spinning around, her smile too tight, too forced. She feigned ignorance, asking what I meant. I didn't let it slide. I gestured toward the door, pointing out how she and Dave seemed unusually friendly. Her laugh followed, but it was strained and brittle, like glass about to shatter. She dismissed my concern, saying it was ridiculous and insisting he was just there to fix the sink. She even added that she liked to make people feel at home, as if that explained everything. Arching an eyebrow, I pushed back, reminding her that Dave was the plumber, not a dinner guest. Her smile dropped, her face hardening as irritation flickered across her features. She snapped that I was reading too much into it, insisting the situation was over. Dave was gone, the sink was fixed, and that was that. But it didn't feel like the end of it. Not by a long shot. I didn't press her further that night. Part of me didn't want to believe what my gut was telling me. I convinced myself that I was overreacting, that there was no way Marlene would betray me like that. But as I lay in bed later, staring at the ceiling while she slept beside me, that unease coiled tighter and tighter in my chest. Something was wrong. I didn't know what it was yet, but I was going to find out. The next morning started like any other. Marlene was up before me, as usual, frying eggs in the kitchen while the coffee pot gurgled in the corner. The smell of breakfast filled the house, warm and inviting, but it didn't have the same comfort it used to. I sat at the table, watching her as she moved around the kitchen with practiced ease. Her smile came too quickly, her laugh too easily, like she was trying to gloss over the unease from the night before. She'd always been good at masking her emotions, something I used to admire about her, but now it felt calculated, almost rehearsed. She noticed my silence as she placed a plate of eggs and toast in front of me, casually remarking that I seemed quiet that morning. I forced a smile, brushing it off with a simple explanation that I was just tired. She nodded, her gaze lingering on me for a moment longer than usual before she turned back to the stove. The conversation, if you could call it that, was strained. She asked about my work schedule, about the Watson's barn, about whether I'd have time to fix the squeaky screen door. I answered in monosyllables, my mind elsewhere. The truth was, I couldn't stop thinking about the way she and Dave had been standing so close the night before. The way her laugh had sounded, different, lighter. The way she'd flushed when I walked into the room. After breakfast, Marlene grabbed her purse and announced she was heading to the store to pick up a few things. She kissed me on the cheek, her lips warm but devoid of the affection they used to hold, and left without waiting for a response. The moment the door shut behind her, I grabbed my phone and stared at it. I felt ridiculous, like some paranoid husband in a bad soap opera, but the nagging feeling in my gut wouldn't let go. I opened her laptop, which was sitting on the counter, and clicked it awake. The screen lit up, but her email and social media were all logged out. That was odd. Marlene never logged out of anything. Next, I reached for her phone, which she'd left charging on the kitchen counter. But when I pressed the home button, the screen demanded a passcode, a new addition. She'd never had her phone locked before. My chest tightened. I set the phone back down, trying to convince myself that this was nothing. Everyone locks their phones these days, right? And maybe she'd logged out of her accounts for privacy. People do that. But the doubts wouldn't stop swirling. I decided to distract myself by tackling some chores. The fence out back needed a fresh coat of paint, and I figured a little manual labor would clear my head. But even as I worked, my mind kept replaying snippets of conversation from the night before. Marlene's forced laugh, her deflective tone, the way she avoided eye contact. And then there was Dave. By mid-afternoon, I couldn't take it anymore. I cleaned up, grabbed my keys, and drove into town. Smith Plumbing and Repairs wasn't hard to find, a small shop tucked between a gas station and a laundromat. I parked out front and stared at the faded sign hanging over the door, my fingers drumming against the steering wheel. Part of me wanted to just drive away, to let it go and trust Marlene like I always had. But the other part, the part that had been chewing on this for hours, couldn't let it rest. I stepped out of the truck and pushed open the door to the shop. The bell above the door jingled as I stepped inside, drawing the attention of a young guy behind the counter who glanced up from a clipboard. He asked if he could help, and I kept my tone casual, mentioning that I was looking for Dave. The guy nodded, explaining that Dave was out on a call but would be back in about an hour, offering to take a message. I declined, saying I'd catch him later. As I turned to leave, he mentioned offhandedly that Dave had been busy lately. There was a grin on his face as he added that word must be getting around about Dave being the best in town. I paused at that, glancing back and repeating the word busy, almost to myself. The guy, still smiling, elaborated that Dave had been handling a lot of private calls recently, even saying some folks specifically requested him by name. The words hung in the air like a bad smell. My jaw tightened as I forced a polite nod and walked out. Back in the truck, my hands gripped the steering wheel as I stared at the shop. The pieces were starting to fall into place, but I didn't like the picture they were painting. When I got home, Marlene was already back from the store, humming to herself as she unpacked groceries. Her demeanor was so normal, so cheerful, that it almost made me doubt myself. Almost. She mentioned casually that she had run into Susan at the store. While glancing over her shoulder, she added that Susan wanted us to come over for dinner on Friday, suggesting it might be nice to catch up. I responded with a distracted, sure, barely registering her words as my mind continued to churn with everything else. That evening, while Marlene was in the shower, I sat at the kitchen table, staring at her phone. I didn't know the passcode, but I noticed the way her fingers moved when she unlocked it earlier. For digits, the same rhythm she always used when entering the PIN for her debit card. I tried it. The screen unlocked, revealing a flurry of messages. My heart hammered as I scrolled through, searching for anything that might explain the unease gnawing at me. Most of the messages were mundane. Chats with her sister, reminders about appointments, but then I found a thread with D. The messages weren't explicit, but they were far too familiar for my liking. Jokes, inside references I didn't understand, and a few vague comments about last time and next time. My hands shook as I locked the phone and set it back on the counter, exactly where I'd found it. Marlene left late in the morning, saying she'd be running errands and stopping by the farmer's market. She rattled off a list of things she needed to pick up: some fresh greens, a bottle of honey, maybe even one of those pies she liked from the bakery stall. Her tone was light, almost breezy, and for a moment, I almost believed everything was normal. But it wasn't. As her car disappeared down the road, I stood in the kitchen, staring out the window and trying to silence the gnawing suspicion that had taken root over the past few days. The signs were there, subtle but undeniable. I just needed to see for myself. Without thinking too hard about it, I grabbed my keys and slipped out the door. My truck roared to life as I pulled onto the road, keeping a good distance between myself and Marlene's car. She wasn't in any hurry, her pace leisurely as she drove toward town. I followed her for about 10 minutes before she took an unexpected turn. The farmer's market was straight ahead, but she veered left, heading toward a quieter part of the city. My hands gripped the steering wheel as I kept my distance, careful not to get too close. She pulled into a side street lined with small shops and parked near a cafe I didn't recognize. I eased my truck into a spot down the block, turning off the engine and watching as she got out of the car. Marlene didn't go into the cafe. Instead, she walked a few doors down to a nondescript building with a faded awning. She paused at the entrance, glancing around quickly before slipping inside. Curiosity burned in my chest. This wasn't the kind of place Marlene would normally frequent. It wasn't upscale, wasn't trendy. It looked like the kind of place people went to when they didn't want to be seen. I waited for a few minutes, debating whether to follow her inside. My heart pounded in my chest as I finally stepped out of the truck and made my way to the building. The door was heavy, and it creaked as I pushed it open. Inside, the air was cool and dim, the faint scent of cleaning supplies hanging in the air. A small lobby greeted me, with a single receptionist sitting behind a desk. She barely glanced up as I stepped in, too focused on the book in her hands. I scanned the room, my eyes landing on a hallway to the right. The faint hum of voices drifted from further inside, but I couldn't make out what was being said. I hesitated, unsure of my next move, when the sound of laughter reached my ears. It was Marlene's laugh. I froze, the sound piercing through me like a shard of glass. I hadn't heard her laugh like that in months, not at home, not with me. Moving carefully, I followed the hallway until I reached a door left slightly ajar. Peering through the crack, I saw her sitting at a small table, across from someone whose face I couldn't immediately see. But I recognized the uniform, dark blue. The plumber. They were leaning in close, their heads bent together as they talked. His hand rested casually on the back of her chair, and her posture was relaxed, almost too comfortable. I stepped back before they could see me, retreating silently to the lobby. My mind raced as I made my way back to the truck, my breaths coming quick and shallow. Back in my truck, I sat gripping the steering wheel, replaying what I'd just seen. The casual intimacy, the ease with which they interacted. It was clear that this wasn't their first meeting. I didn't follow her when she left the building an hour later, carrying a bag that didn't look like it came from the farmer's market. I didn't need to. The pieces were already falling into place, each one sharper and more damning than the last. When she came home that afternoon, humming as she carried a bag of groceries into the house, I didn't say anything. I just watched her, the weight of what I'd seen sitting heavy in my chest. The truth wasn't just knocking at the door anymore. It had let itself in, bold and undeniable. After we sat down for dinner, our conversation revolved around the usual, everyday topics. Marlene asked me about work, and I tried to give her a brief rundown of my day, even though my mind was far from the subject. She listened attentively, nodding at the right moments, though her gaze seemed focused yet slightly distant. After dinner, I settled on the couch with the remote in my hand and started mindlessly flipping through channels. The TV was on, but I hardly paid attention to the screen. Meanwhile, Marlene picked up her favorite book and sat in the armchair by the window. Her eyes moved across the pages, but now and then, I had the feeling she was lost in her own thoughts rather than the story in the novel. That evening, we went to bed without much conversation. Each of us remained in our own world, and while we were physically close, there was an invisible distance between us. At night the house was dark and still as I slipped out of bed. Marlene's soft breathing filled the room, steady and peaceful, as if the weight of her secrets hadn't left a mark on her. I moved quietly, careful not to wake her, and made my way to the bathroom. Standing in front of the sink, I stared at my reflection for a moment. My face was calm, but inside, my thoughts churned. I turned on the faucet, letting the water run while I reached under the counter and loosened the pipe connection just enough to cause a slow but steady drip. Next, I moved to the toilet. A slight nudge to the handle chain inside the tank ensured it wouldn't flush properly. The water flowed continuously into the bowl, creating a quiet but noticeable trickle. It wasn't enough to cause damage, just enough to be inconvenient. Enough to make sure Marlene would call for help. When the setup was complete, I shut off the faucet, wiped my hands on a towel, and slipped back into bed. Marlene didn't stir, her back still turned to me. I stared at the ceiling, waiting for morning. The first rays of sunlight filtered through the curtains when the alarm went off. Marlene groaned, rolling over and pulling the blanket tighter around her shoulders. I got up as usual, moving through the morning routine like nothing was out of place. The sound of water dripping caught her attention as she passed the bathroom. Pausing in the doorway, she frowned at the sight. She mentioned groggily that the sink was leaking. I leaned out from the kitchen, putting on an air of surprise and casually remarking that it must have started acting up overnight. She sighed as she examined the problem further and noticed with irritation that the toilet was not working either, adding to her growing frustration for the day. Glancing at my watch, I slung my bag over my shoulder and explained that I'd love to help but had to get to work, suggesting she call someone to take a look. She rolled her eyes, muttering under her breath as I kissed her cheek on my way out. I offered a quick, "See you tonight," before stepping into the crisp morning air. I drove around the block and parked in a spot that gave me a clear view of the house. My heart pounded as I sat there, waiting. About an hour later, I saw her come out onto the porch, her phone pressed to her ear. She talked briefly, glancing toward the bathroom window, and then went back inside. Another half-hour passed before the plumber's van pulled into the driveway. I recognized Dave immediately, his toolbox in hand as he approached the door. Marlene greeted him with a warm smile, stepping aside to let him in. I slipped out of the truck, moving quickly and quietly across the yard. My boots barely made a sound as I positioned myself near the side window. The curtains were partially drawn, but I could still see into the kitchen. They talked for a while, Dave nodding as Marlene gestured toward the bathroom. He disappeared down the hall, toolbox in hand, while she followed close behind. I crept along the side of the house, keeping low. The bathroom window was slightly open, letting in the cool morning air. From my spot beneath it, I could hear the murmur of their voices. At first, the conversation was technical, pipes, valves, repairs. But then Marlene laughed, the sound light and familiar in a way that made my stomach turn. I moved back toward the living room window, crouching beneath it and peering through the gap in the curtains. The sight that met my eyes confirmed everything. Dave stepped out of the bathroom, wiping his hands on a rag, and Marlene leaned in closer, her hand brushing against his arm. They exchanged a few more words, and then, as if it was the most natural thing in the world, they turned and walked toward the bedroom together. I crouched by the window, my heart hammering in my chest as the moment stretched into what felt like hours. The image of Marlene and Dave heading to the bedroom burned in my mind, replaying over and over like a cruel loop. Part of me wanted to storm in immediately, but something held me back, a mix of disbelief, anger, and the need to see this through. The house was quiet now, save for the occasional creak of floorboards and muffled movements. The stillness only amplified the rage simmering inside me. I shifted slightly, my muscles tense and ready, waiting for the right moment. Minutes passed, though they felt like an eternity. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. Moving with deliberate silence, I crept around to the back door. It was unlocked, as it often was during the day. I slipped inside, the familiar scent of the house now tainted by the weight of betrayal. The hallway leading to the bedroom felt longer than ever, each step heavy with dread. As I approached, faint sounds reached my ears, soft at first, but unmistakable. My breath caught as I recognized the moans, the rhythm of the bed creaking in time with their movements. My blood boiled. The calm I had forced upon myself shattered in an instant. Without hesitation, I strode to the bedroom door and kicked it open with a force that echoed through the house. The scene before me confirmed every suspicion, every dark thought I had tried to suppress. There they were, Marlene and Dave tangled together in the bed we had shared for years. The sheets were a mess, their bodies intertwined, her hair spilling over the pillow as she arched beneath him. His shirt was off, his back covered in a sheen of sweat as he moved over her with a casual confidence that made my stomach turn. Marlene's eyes shot open at the sound of the door slamming against the wall. Her face twisted into a mask of shock and terror as she realized who stood there. Dave froze, his head snapping around to face me, his expression morphing from confusion to fear in an instant. "What the?" he started, but I didn't let him finish. Rage propelled me forward. Before he could react, I grabbed him by the shoulder and yanked him off the bed. He stumbled, barely finding his footing before my fist connected with his jaw. The impact was solid, the crack of bone against bone reverberating through the room. Dave collapsed onto the floor with a groan, clutching his face as he tried to push himself up. Marlene screamed, scrambling to cover herself with the sheet, but I barely spared her a glance. My focus was on him, The man who had dared to invade my home, my life. "You piece of trash," I growled, hauling him to his feet. He didn't fight back, too stunned to do anything but stumble as I dragged him toward the hallway. Marlene's desperate voice rang out behind me, pleading for me to stop. Her tone was thick with panic, but I didn't even glance back. My focus was locked, my fury blinding. Gripping the front door handle with one hand, I used the other to shove Dave forcefully onto the porch. He stumbled over the threshold, losing his footing and landing hard on the gravel walkway outside. My voice was raw, trembling with unrestrained anger as I barked at him to get out. I added a final warning, a threat laced with conviction, making it clear he was never to set foot near my house again. Dave scrambled to his feet, his eyes wide with a mix of fear and humiliation. He didn't say a word, just grabbed his shirt from where it had fallen near the driveway and bolted for his van. I stood there, breathing heavily, watching as he fumbled with his keys and started the engine. The van roared to life, kicking up a cloud of dust as he sped away. When I turned back toward the house, Marlene was standing in the doorway, clutching the sheet around her like it could shield her from the storm that had just erupted. Her face was pale, her eyes red-rimmed and filled with something that might have been regret, or maybe just panic at being caught. The silence between us was deafening, heavier than anything I'd ever felt before. I finally broke the tense silence, my voice low and cold as I muttered for her to get inside. She hesitated, her mouth opening as if to speak, but no words came. Finally, she stepped back into the house and I followed, shutting the door behind me with a finality that echoed through the hollow spaces of what used to be our life. The air in the house was heavy, thick with the aftermath of what had just happened. Marlene stood in the living room, clutching the sheet tightly around her, her shoulders trembling as if the weight of everything was finally pressing down on her. I leaned against the wall, my arms crossed, staring at her with a mixture of anger and disgust. For a moment, she seemed like a completely different person, a fragile, remorseful shadow of the woman I thought I knew. Her voice was shaky as she began to speak, words tumbling out in a frantic, desperate stream. She said she hadn't meant for any of this to happen, that it was a mistake, a moment of weakness. She tried to explain herself, weaving a story about feeling neglected, unappreciated, and how everything had just spiraled out of control. It was an attempt to appeal to my sense of reason, to claw her way back into my good graces, but I didn't say a word. I just stood there, watching her unravel as she shifted between pleading and trying to justify her actions. Her face was streaked with tears, and her hands clutched the sheet like it was the only thing holding her together. When she finally fell silent, looking at me with wide, tear-filled eyes, I told her it didn't matter anymore. I told her that whatever excuses she had, whatever reasons she wanted to give, it wouldn't change what had happened. This wasn't something we could come back from. It was over. The moment I said it, the air shifted. Her face, so soft and full of contrition just seconds ago, hardened in an instant. The tears stopped flowing, her mouth twisted into a sneer, and the apology that had seemed so genuine seconds ago was gone like it had never existed. Her voice turned cold, sharp, like the edge of a blade. She spat out that I had no right to judge her, that I wasn't some perfect husband myself. She accused me of being distant, of caring more about my work and my routines than I ever did about her. The words kept coming, each one more venomous than the last. She claimed she hadn't been happy in years, that I should have seen this coming. It wasn't her fault, she said, not entirely. If I had been paying attention, if I had made her feel wanted, none of this would have happened. I stood there, letting her rant, letting her try to shift the blame onto me. The anger in her voice was almost laughable, considering the scene I'd walked in on just minutes earlier. But the more she spoke, the more I realized that this wasn't about me. It was about her. Her choices, her selfishness, her inability to own up to what she'd done. She finally stopped, breathing hard, her eyes blazing with defiance. I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. The silence stretched between us like a chasm, deeper and wider than anything we'd ever faced before. I turned away from her, heading toward the front door. I could feel her glare burning into my back, but I didn't look at her. As I stepped outside, The cool air hit me like a slap, sharp and bracing. For the first time in what felt like forever, I took a deep breath, letting it fill my lungs. The house behind me, with all its memories and all its lies, felt like a prison I was finally escaping. Marlene could stay inside and rage all she wanted. Let her cling to her justifications and her bitterness. It didn't matter anymore. I was done. I stepped off the porch, heading for the truck. Inside, I sat for a moment, staring at the steering wheel and letting my thoughts settle. This wasn't just about her betrayal. It was about all the lies, the smugness, the way she had dragged my life through the mud without a second thought. My mind turned to practical matters first. I wasn't going to let her walk away with everything we'd built. The house, the accounts, everything that tied us together. I was going to sever those ties, and she'd feel every cut. The next morning, I called Paul, my lawyer. I laid out everything, from the affair to the financials. Paul was a sharp guy, and he didn't waste time sugarcoating things. He said divorces could get messy, especially when infidelity was involved, but he assured me that I had the upper hand if I played my cards right. Over the next week, I moved methodically, ensuring Marlene wouldn't have the chance to weasel her way out of the mess she'd made. I contacted the bank to separate our accounts, freezing the joint ones until the dust settled. Marlene, for her part, tried to act like everything was business as usual. She avoided the topic of what had happened, going about her days as if the life we'd shared wasn't crumbling around her. It wasn't until the paperwork arrived that reality started to sink in. The process server handed her the envelope one morning while she was still in her robe, a mug of coffee in hand. Her face turned pale as she flipped through the documents, her fingers trembling slightly. That night, she confronted me, her voice shrill as she demanded to know what I thought I was doing. She accused me of being cruel, of punishing her unfairly, of trying to ruin her life. I told her the truth. She'd already ruined it. I was just making sure she didn't get away unscathed. Her reaction was predictable. She ranted and raved, throwing out every insult she could think of. But the anger only confirmed what I already knew. She wasn't sorry for what she'd done. She was sorry for getting caught. The divorce moved quickly. Paul ensured that the evidence of her infidelity worked in my favor, limiting what she could claim. The house stayed in my name, as did the savings we'd built together. Marlene left with little more than her clothes and her defiance, muttering about how she'd be better off without me. But her words didn't matter. A few weeks after she moved out, I heard through the grapevine that Dave had lost a significant chunk of his clientele after word of the affair spread. Silver City wasn't a big town, and people talked. It turned out that I wasn't the only one who'd heard about his extracurricular activities. As for Marlene, I didn't bother keeping tabs on her. Whatever life she carved out for herself after this, it wasn't my concern. The morning after she left, I sat on the porch with a cup of coffee, watching the sun rise over the yard. The air felt lighter, the silence no longer oppressive but peaceful. She'd made her choices, and now she was living with the fallout. For the first time in months, I felt a flicker of hope. Hope for something better, something real. Marlene had paid the price for her betrayal. Now it was my turn to rebuild.